ago, when the UPA government and the then Planning Commission tried to define what constitutes or defines a poor person, they were ridiculed, and the protests ranged from condemnation about the insensitivity to the sheer impracticality of it. How could you, the critics said, be called middle class if you spend just more than 32 rupees a day? On the show today, we have another theory about poverty. What if we were to tell you that there are young people out there who went to Indian Institute of Management and have a job, but are so much in debt they consider themselves to be poor? What if we were to introduce you to someone who had to work more than one job because they just had to, they couldn't afford all that they needed? The respectable publishing day job they had just didn't pay enough. What about a young person who can afford a car but can't afford rent, so slept a couple of weeks in that car? Would you classify them as the urban poor? Or would you call them entitled and dismiss them as people who just made wrong choices, especially when the official definition is something as basic as someone who earns or spends 47 rupees in urban areas, and when the visual image of poverty is someone who doesn't have a roof over their heads or clothes or enough to feed their children, the ones we see on the streets begging? That officially undermines the people who have been profiled in this new book by Gayatri Jayaraman called Who Me? Poor? This book profiles young people below 35 or millennials who defy the traditional image of poor. They are in a way like the invisible poor. They look like they are wearing nice clothes, but maybe only eating one meal a day. They may look like they're having a nice cup of coffee, which is worth more than 100 rupees a shot, but maybe living out of their car. Why do they have a car? Because of the need to keep up appearances. So what do you call them? Poor or misguided? Let me just introduce our panelists for this fascinating discussion and these interesting phenomenon which is taking place across cities, and these are real people who've been profiled in the book, and we'll be meeting some of them. First of all, the author of this book, Gayatri Jayaraman, she joins us from Mumbai. We also have someone featured in the book, Kalki Koechlin, well-known actor from Mumbai, who talks about the pressures she faced and can identify with some of these traits as well. We have two other people featured in the book, Shoma Bhattacharjee, who moved from Assam to Bengaluru, and Ronnie Kuriakose, who's now in a program, who's pursuing art in Kochi, but could identify and talks about the time that he spent mixing jobs in New Delhi. And of course, Rama Bijapurkar, who writes about economy and trends. Gayatri, I just want to start by asking you, this book actually started with an article that you wrote for BuzzFeed, right? How did you go ahead and, go ahead with the book despite the amount of criticism that you got?
I think, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. I think the book, the essay got a fair amount of criticism, but more than the criticism, I was flooded with an influx of people who had actually lived that and who were going through it and who had been through it and who were facing extremes of hunger. The stories just flooded in for days. I had at the end of it almost 400 messages in my inboxes, both on Twitter and Facebook, strangers reaching out. And effectively, I think for me, this book is more crowdsourced than it is something that, I've individually sort of pieced together, because the information just flew at me. And that's when I realized that it just needed a curtain of silence to be lifted. And so it's not really about responding to criticism, it's about the people who have lived this, and it's about telling their stories, which to me is the more important thing to focus on.
Yeah, and what's really interesting actually, for me, it's really worrying, and why we wanted to focus on that is it's a new trend. And you talk about, and perhaps we can all see it in our offices as well, you talk about noticing some of the younger people, noticing some of the things that you would have done or anybody would have done, and then noticing that in younger people as well who were too ashamed to talk about it. Of course, what's interesting is that Kalki Koechlin, you're featured in the book, and some people might find that totally unbelievable. How is a famous person like you, how do you identify with a phenomenon like urban poor? How can you identify with this?
Oh, I don't think I'm featured in the sense that I identify with it. I feel that the person that I am is somebody who actually has had not the financial support from family, but always the mental and emotional support from family. And I think a lot of the stories and case studies in Gayatri's book are of people who don't have that emotional support, you know, as well as the financial support. So I think that if I hadn't had that emotional or mental support from a family who was like, you can search for what you want to do and find your way and all of that, although I had to really struggle financially, and I was a waitress for many years in London, and I did many odd jobs, I never felt that I needed to hide it, or that I was ashamed of it, or, you know, I never had to tell my parents that that I was failing or whatever. I had that side supporting me, so I never felt this pressure to be like, oh, I need to show more than what I am. You know, so for example, the thing that I have a Swift, you know, I drive a Swift car, and a lot of, you know, producers and people have always said, why don't you get a better looking car? It might help with your work and your appearance at work. And it's true, as celebrities, we do, I think, lie about our appearance, in the sense we wear these very grand designer clothes which we don't pay for ourselves, which we get to borrow and then return. So we look richer than we are. But I wouldn't consider myself poor in any way. And I think that a lot of what the book explores is also sort of a mindset of you know, this thing of wanting to hide. The story of the girl who lived out of her car and came to work, but just didn't want to tell anyone. You know, the only thing was that nobody should find out that she doesn't have money. I think that was, for me, a really striking story, and it is very much about not having the emotional or mental support around you, the social support around you.
Which is interesting, and you know, you talk about the family thing, and I think perhaps, Shoma, in your story, which I read, of going from Assam to Bengaluru, the family thing was another added pressure, isn't it? That young people feel that they can't disappoint the family, and so you can't ask for help, which perhaps Kalki felt that she could get that help from her family. You felt that extra pressure because you weren't making enough money, and yet what's interesting is that in order to make more money, we need to borrow more money or to have more money. So it's like a catch-22. Tell us about those experiences.
Yes. Thank you, Sunetra, for having me on the show. When I came to Bangalore, I did not really know how the situation would be for me. So it was very, you know, for me it was that there has to be a job, and I would earn and support my family. But when I landed here, I realized that there is you know, the inclusivity is such a big question. You know, you have to hang around with people, you are into advertising, so you have to have people who are partying and all of that. They have to be knowing of all the famous trends that is going on. That is where you need that extra money. Now, your job really don't support that. It doesn't give you that extra money. So what do you do with that? You go with these friends and they pay for you. And in the end, you are, you know, at the end of the month, you realize that you have so many, already so many debts to clear, because you have to have that lifestyle because job wants from you.
You are one of those people who skipped meals, who didn't have enough to have 3 meals a day.
Yeah, because you know, that's exactly the point that I was coming at. I had PG accommodation which had 1,000 extra for meals. So if I skip that meal, I can save that money. If I save that money, I can, you know, maybe Friday night with friends, I can go out with them and all of that. I had to cut down for my entire monthly expenditure for that one Friday night. that was, you know, something which I realized that I shouldn't have done, but I have done, because I didn't realize there was nobody, and there was no term called urban poor who could describe and define and tell you that no, this is something you should not be doing. This is something, a life which you are pretending to have.
But can we really dismiss Shoma's experiences, Rama Bijapurkar? Is this the real urban poor which perhaps people are not aware of?
I don't think this is the urban poor as the way I would describe it. The urban poor are basically people who have below a particular level of income. I think here it appears to me that this is maybe a set of people who are either living beyond their means and therefore bridging it with debt, which is true of the very poor, the very rich, and a certain segment that is borrowing. Or it appears to me that this is a function of consumption choices that people are making, that I would rather go out on Friday night than have breakfast every day. So I don't know that this is really what we would call poor by any stretch of imagination. Strapped for cash because my expenditure is more than my income, yes. And so I'm actually struggling a little bit with trying to understand why this is urban poor.
I understand what you're saying, because that's what the traditional criticism has also been, because, you know, we've always looked at it that way, and yet I'm trying to think of this as how would you describe this phenomenon? And perhaps, Ronnie, you can come in here and explain. What was interesting in your story for our viewers is that Ronnie Kuriakose is featured in this book. He talks about his years in publishing in Delhi, just starting out, and yet, Ronnie, why did you feel the need to also go out and get this other job, do this thing of, you know, helping at the golf club or other things that you... Yeah, tell us.
Well, I wouldn't term them jobs. It's seeking out experiences, because at the end of the day, it's not so much about how much cash you're missing, or you know, your desire to be seen drinking posh coffee or to be seen wearing those fancy clothes. I think it's more to do with the lack of creativity or accessibility, especially people who have moved in from smaller towns to bigger cities. I think it is reflective on them the most than on others. So I think it's that desire to be on the same level that is pushing these young, including me, young, you know, people to do the stuff that they are doing. And to give you a little more detail on my experience, I wasn't necessarily doing other jobs. What I was doing was create avenues for myself that would help me develop the other ideas that I had in mind.